So we have the next presentation by Maximilian Günnewig Mönert. Now from Europe, we are going to North America, to New York City, and we also go a little bit back historically. So Max, please.
Sure.
Can you share your slides?
Here. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Max. I'm a PhD student at Trinity College Dublin, and this is joint work with Sun-Hyun Lee from Yale and Ron Lyons from Trinity College. And our paper, which is still very preliminary, work in progress, but we hope to make it consistent enough. So it's called Under Control, New York City Rent Control in the 1920s. And what is the motivation for this paper? So the motivation for this paper is that in 1920, New York City introduced the first rent control laws in the history of the United States. And what is interesting about this case is that it's kind of a new type of rent control. It's neither second nor first generation rent control, whereas it exhibits some features of second generation rent control. So the law stipulated that rent increases by more than 25% per year were generally prohibited, and the laws empowered elected municipal district court judges to judge in landlord-tenant cases if a rent increase was reasonable. So this gave judges de facto discretionary authority to set rents according to their own beliefs of reasonableness. To give you a quick example, this laws allowed, for example, a tenant to withhold rent payments. A landlord would go in front of the court, to the district court, and would try to obtain eviction warrants in summary proceedings. And during the summary proceedings, which are kind of shortened legal processes, the judge would make a decision, for example, if he would grant the eviction warrant, for example, or he was empowered, for example, to say, okay, the rent increase is unjust, he could kind of freeze the rent. And yeah, so we think this is a very interesting case, which kind of exhibits type of second generation rent control feature. So what are we going to do? Why can I not go further? Yeah. What are we doing? So this paper investigates the policy's impact on New York City's housing market. And we are going to ask what are the effects of rent control on rents and prices. So this is basically a very preliminary research question, more or less to guide you through the presentation to make it coherent, but I will explain a bit more at the end. How do we do it? So we use newly digitized housing market data, we digitize conveyance prices, sales, basically rents and new construction data. And we intend to use judge level variation in order to obtain causal evidence of the impact of rent control. And okay, again, this of course, very preliminary. So what we find, or what I'm going to show you here is that rent control increases rents and transaction prices in uncontrolled parts of the market. So a bit, to give you a bit of context, of the rent control laws. So after World War II, soaring rents and social unrest forced the city of New York to act. There was kind of the Red Scare. The socialists were gaining seats in the state parliament and so on. And the democratic government of New York, and the highest, they stipulated, they enacted these rent laws in April 1920, which stipulated that the whole stock of New York City was under control, and only buildings built with a building of finalization date or construction date from April 1920 onwards were exempted from rent control. So in 1926, there was a first wave of luxury decontrol, decontrolling all buildings or all objects, properties renting for $20 per room per month or more. And the laws expired for the rest of the stock in 1929. So how was it linked to the judges? The judges, the municipal district court judges, were elected for a period of 10 years in partisan elections. So each individual who was living in a certain municipal court district was eligible to vote. And what is interesting about this, when one reads the literature on judges, is that the electorate tends to use this fact to elect judges in accordance with party ideology. Judges made judicial interpretation on what rents are reasonable, and I explained this before a bit how this worked, and they could grant stays of up to 1 year. So it was kind of a mix of rent control and as well kind of protection of tenancy itself. So there were some tenant and landlord judges. This is what we are taking from the historical literature, which informs us that there were judges who were basically granting any increase, and there were some judges who were not granting any increase, who were saying it doesn't matter, who were saying this publicly in the newspapers, it doesn't matter which landlord is coming in front of my cause, he will never get through with any eviction warrant. The related literature, of course, relating to the literature on misallocation and welfare losses, famously stated by Glaser and Lattmer. However, this paper or this presentation in particular is more related to the literature on measuring the degree of housing market distortion, which usually finds, which is huge, and these are just some examples, and which usually finds substantial variation in the degree by which housing market outcomes are affected. Sometimes this literature finds that housing markets are strongly affected. Sometimes it finds that it's not very well affected, not very much affected, and where even the mechanisms through which the effect on the housing market works differs widely. And last but not least, we're referring to the literature on judge level variation, which usually asks question of social science or political economy. What are the effects, for example, on media, on judges' sentencing behavior, or how does party alignment affect sentence lengths or something like this? The data we are going to use, we are digitizing data from the Builders and Records Guides. I showed you one example. This is an example of a conveyance. It's just a screenshot of the conveyances from it's called New York City's Records and Builders Guide, which is a half-yearly published newspaper for the industry, which lists a lot. I mean, it's huge. It lists tons of conveyances, of new mortgages, of foreclosures, of foreclosure decisions for the whole half year, for all over New York City, but mainly Manhattan and the Bronx. And we digitize these, OCR these, and then we pass these data in order to quantify them. Can I go back? Oh, yeah. Then judge information, judge name, residential address, municipal court district in which the judges live, and party affiliation we take from the Green Book. This is the official register of the City of New York, where all civil servants are listed. For the judges, they are listed there with their address, their name, their party affiliation, their re-election date. And last but not least, we digitize data from the New York Times real estate rental records. So we established kind of a data collection process which ensures randomness across the real estate section. And we obtain random samples from the New York Times real estate sections on a monthly basis. These data actually have been collected by hand. And for other exercises we use a full count population census of the United States.
Max, 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes left. Okay, so these are descriptive statistics. We have about 9,000 objects or rental objects from 1980 to 1935. On average, our rent, the rental objects, or the rent per room, better to say it better, is $47, which is nearly double the amount of when you think of the luxury decontrol limit. So we are rather at the upper end of the at the upper end of the distribution. And on average, we have 2 judges per municipal court district, and Republican judges per municipal court district. We have around half of the judges are Republican judges. What is our identification strategy? So we are going to argue that rent control varies with political alignment of the judges. So we argue that the Republicans are a party of big business, and they usually oppose legislation designed to redistribute wealth or to assist the laboring classes, which indicates that Republican judges should have been inclined to rule in favor of landlords. Democrats at this time were rather torn in their political opinion between the progressive electorates in the cities and the rural southern states. So these would be our tenant judges. And that is the regional distribution for certain years of the share of Republican judges of all judges in a municipal court district. We can see that in 1920, usually districts were either completely Republican or completely Democrat. Only in Upper Manhattan, we have some mixed districts. What we can see as well is that the more we approach the New Deal, Republicans disappear completely. We aggregate our rent data by neighborhoods, just to show the distribution of rents. So we, as already said, we mainly cover Manhattan, certain part of the Bronx consistently. The rest is not covered by our data. The same is true for the price data obtained from the conveyances. Mainly Manhattan very consistently indeed. The Bronx covered better than with the rent data as well, but Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island are barely covered. That is our identification strategy. So we use a continuous treatment where we use the share of Republican judges in year T in District M and the number of Republican judges in year T in District M as our treatment. Post is a post variable, is an indicator variable equal to 1 after 1919, so for 1920 and so onwards. X are individual controls. If available for the rent data, we have them. And theta and gamma are fixed effects. So how does this result look like? So in column 1, we see the effect of the share of Republican judges on after the introduction of rent control on rent. And what you can see that in how to read it would be that in 100% Republican controlled judges, rents are 90% higher than in 100% Democratic controlled judge districts after the introduction of rent control. For prices, this is even 55% higher. And the number of Republican judges would be each Republican judge adds up 6% of higher rent in its district compared to Democratic district after the introduction of rent control. R squared is not very high, so these results should be taken with a grain of salt. It should be mentioned here as well that we use quality controls like the building type, number of rooms, if water was included, heat was included, and so on. We have a lot of controls for the rent variables, for our rents, for our objects. When we look on the event studies, well, we see this huge hike in rents in Republican, or we see this huge hike in the Republican treatment after 1920, whereas before it is rather flat, even if we cannot really exclude pre-treatments at this stage, because first of all, we only have these two time periods before the introduction of the treatment. However, it's rather seen that our treatment is orthogonal, that our outcome is orthogonal to the treatment. Well, and I'm coming to the final slide. So what does it suggest? So taken with a grain of salt, This result might suggest that there have been a segmented market effect going on, so that controls where they were very high, like in Democrat districts, were decreasing rental supply, which were creating excess demand for the uncontrolled areas, in this case, the Republican areas. However, one should take these results with a grain of salt. We have as well other ideas what one could perform. For example, one could look on the effect on commercial developments. So imagine that rent on residential developments is frozen in Democratic district. Maybe a real estate developer would switch to other type of developments they could pursue. And effects on the on residents after the abolition of controls is just like what happens actually to people, what are the second generation order effects of rent control on individuals which are forced to leave, and what is happening to them afterwards. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks a lot, Max,
for your attention.
Yeah, and an impressive work. There's one question from Sophie, please.
Thank you very much. So thanks for this nice presentation. I have, I mean, how sure can you actually be that people vote certain parties because of rent issues, yes or no? Can that actually be? Because I don't know exactly how because the judges would be determined by the governor, or however that, it's not a governor on that level, I think, but the judges are voted for, right?
The judges are elected directly.
Directly.
So you have a list of candidates. You vote for them, and so let's say then if this district has determined to be 2 judges, then the first 2, or the person with the 2 highest votes are getting the district. Okay, and is any partisan relationship actually stated? Yeah, it is asked that they have to be part in a party. So we even have a socialist judge at this time. So
okay, great.
The Socialist Party of the United States.
But the question is also, how much was the pre-trend in that, were these states or like small regions that always voted like for more conservative one, or then some areas which just traditionally would always vote for liberal ones? Because that would actually be, you know, kind of out of tradition. People would just always vote like that. And you have this kind of historical patterns probably in many elections anyhow. So the question is really whether this is, I mean, so that would be actually good because then it would be completely exogenous. But then the question could also be, okay, there's now a problem with rents and with sales, and now we go for the more liberal one or something like that. So can you rule out any such kind of effects that this is really not exogenous and not jointly determined?
Well, I mean, first of all, the introduction of these rent control measures were kind of an ultima ratio for the state, for the city government. They tried other things before, but I'm not sure if it was clear to the public that they were introducing such a mechanism and that they were empowering the judges to rule over the rent. So, for example, you vote for your judge before according to what he represents, and then as far as I understand you, the question is the choice, or sorry, what is, sorry, I don't understand the question completely. Could you repeat it?
No, I was just actually wondering whether these judges, the person who is voted for, that this is already kind of related to rent issues. So people already know their opinions about that topic, maybe because out of the partisan affiliation, I don't know. Or whether this is really exogenous, and that could actually be shown in a way that you say these states have always been Republican or always been liberal or something like that. That would be great if it's, I see, you know, something like that.
Yeah, you mean.
But then this was really an issue that was debated, maybe.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's an issue, so we have to vote now for a different type of charge, because that means that we will get a better help for that. Also, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. You mean that this outcome kind of occurs because of actually reverse causality?
Yes.
That judges that rents are high, people vote for judges. Then this policy comes, they vote for another judge, and this kind of the rent actually their rent level affects rather the judge, and then the other way around.
Which could only be true when it was really a big issue. If there were tons of other issues, then maybe rent were not the most pressing issue. But who knows?
Yeah. No, but that's a great point. No, actually, we were not thinking in this direction. We were rather concerned that there were pre-trends, but we are more confident to say that this is not the case, because even if people were raising rents or landlords were raising rents before in anticipation of rent control laws, I mean, they could not expect if they were if their judge they voted for in their district was actually empowered to do something about them. So we would rather expect that these pre-trends are random or at least homogeneous. Yeah, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Sorry for interrupting you.
Also reported in newspapers such kind of things if they were there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Such discussions.
Sorry for interrupting you. We have quite a strict schedule. One question is from Maya Mark. Please.
Hi, Max. Thank you so much. It was fascinating, really, really interesting. I think it emphasizes a repeating pattern that we can see in most presentations, and it's the strong links between the general political context and rent control policy. And I wanted to ask you if there's any way to trace like campaigns, local campaigns for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and to see if they were communicating to the constituency in regard of this specific topic. Was it an issue that was present in these campaigns? I think it really relates to the things that you're talking about. So I was wondering if there are, I don't know, through newspapers or archives, if these historical materials actually exist. I think it can be a really interesting angle. And thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for the question. It's a super interesting question, because actually these laws were state laws. So the city government always had to go to Albany in order to coordinate with the policymaker over there. So yeah, there must have been talks and kind of stuff around, but we were not following this avenue so much. But yeah, probably if there should be at least something like maybe in parliamentary in records of speeches or so on.
I think the book that you cited, Fogelson, describes a lot of these political discussions.
Exactly, there are a lot of sources in it.
Yeah.